How long have you been involved in disability activism in Utah?
Well, in one way or another, probably almost 50 years, if not that long.
We started running into housing issues, and this is, early on, like 91, 92. And that's when I kind of reached out to the Disabled Rights Action Committee, because you start looking, and back then it was the phone book. And you go through the phone book and you look, and luckily the Disabled Rights Action Committee was listed in the phone book. I packed my wife and my 3 kids up, and we went down to a meeting, and it was at a warehouse, and they had a big garage door, and the whole place was filled. There must have been 100 people with disabilities there. It's interesting to meet so many people that were having the same issues that we were.
Well, I lived in senior housing in West Valley, and they had, DRAC came to our clubhouse, and when I seen what it was about, I got really interested. I thought, that's a good thing. Going to the meetings every month, and then I went on a few trips to Washington, D.C. and to Denver, Colorado.
It was really grassroots. It was really street level. That's why I'm always so overwhelmed and in awe of not only Barbara, of course, and others who showed up to the strike line and continued to be on the strike line day and night for whatever it takes, going back to DC and going to LA or wherever there happens to be a action going on.
We set it up so that Barbara Toomer ran a Catholic-funded program out of the Crossroads Center. This was between 85 and probably 89. But in that time, we did a lot of stuff back and forth with the disabled community. She was a disabled person. She would come talk about utility issues. She would be in her chair with, in her assisted chair, and she was very articulate and very convincing and non-threatening.
She drove ambulances. She was a pinup girl before she had polio. And how she really charged into this. She used to chain herself to UTA buses. That's what a lot of her arrests for. And then she traveled with National Adapt.
We had different organizations that kind of worked Utah Independent Housing, things like that. But pretty much when it came to standing up for people's rights with disabilities, Barbara was one of the few people that would actually get out there and get her face in front of everybody and tell them this is where it's got to stop. I think one of the most memorable events that I remember was when Barbara went after one of the banks that wasn't where drive-through windows wasn't accessible. And she went after him hook, tooth, and nail. And it didn't take very long before they had their operation completely turned around and totally accessible. And I got a kick out of the way she dealt with the bank president there. People didn't like to get on the bad side of Barbara. She just had a way about her, but it's just her personality. She just had a way she could stare you down and just glaze and make you want to back off and never want to cross her path again.
Everybody was working for the same thing. Everybody had their own version of the same story, where they or somebody in their family had been discriminated against or diminished, had their life diminished because they were disabled and there was no accommodation for that. There was no effort to make folks with disabilities part of the larger community. And that was really the fight, and I think that's really what everybody had in common when you get right down to it. They wanted to be part of the larger community, just like everybody else.
People don't necessarily realize just how capable we are. Back in the 504 era, when we were fighting for 504, and they did the Capitol steps, they climbed the Capitol steps. We had full paraplegics crawling up those steps. I think it's nice to see that just because you're in a wheelchair doesn't mean you are wheelchair bound.
The first one I went on, I walked, and it was hard. It was hard on me, and you know, my disabilities are like old age. Oh, we would go out about 9 o'clock in the morning. We'd be all lined up, and we'd be lined up for blocks. Yeah. And we'd go on up and do our march and show all our signs and have a megaphone and do the hollering and stuff like that. And
my first memories of DRAC were, you know, protests and handcuff yourselves to the railing. So I'm like, okay, well, that's kind of a little much. I'm not really take that approach. I just do the letter and have meetings, set up times to meet with senators. And
Well, you know, we never knew what was going to happen. As far as the police were concerned, I mean, this was civil disobedience. I don't know that we broke any laws with the crawl-on, actually. People would get out of their chairs. There weren't any lifts. They crawled up the stairs to get into the bus. What were they supposed to do? Or in some cases, some of us actually picked people up out of their chairs who weren't even able to crawl and carried them into the bus and sat them down. And I don't know that we broke any laws. When they blocked the buses, yeah, probably so. But it was hard. I think it was hard for the police to think about arresting a bunch of people in wheelchairs. It was at every national action too. They did. But it was always very difficult for the police to figure out how to manage all the people and all the equipment. And actually, I was pretty terrified with the blocking of the buses because some of the people, like Rick, who comes to mind, I think he's passed away, were so aggressive. I was sure somebody was going to get flattened by one of these buses because you had to get tight up to the front and back so they couldn't maneuver. And, you know, people were just basically tackling buses and then trying to maneuver into place quickly enough so that they couldn't get free. So that was pretty wild. I've always considered the disabled activists who did all that work and still are engaged in that work as very heroic people because their health, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, their health is so tenuous. I know the folks I worked with in Chicago, they're so fragile, and yet they would take that, you know, that precious life that they have and take all kinds of risks.
everybody being together, all for the same cause. And all these different disabled people, and that's quite a grueling trip to go there and do that march and go up to the capitals and here's all these people that have disabilities and they're doing it. It's not somebody else doing it, they're doing it. And that gives me goosebumps to talk about it.
Oh, can I talk about when we shut down State Street? Please. This was my favorite event. It was my birthday present the year that we did it. I got invited to a super secret meeting with LaPetty and Kat Kellemeyer and Sarah, and we all agreed to keep everything secret, and we were going to get arrested and to square away our bond money and lawyer phone numbers, and I had to find a place to park my kids. And it was so exciting, and Dita Seed was there too. She was doing some work for DRAC at the time. And she said, we're going to go into the federal building for a regular rally, but then we're going to sneak out to the crosswalk, and then we're going to stay there. I said, no, Dita, we have to turn around. So when the media takes our picture, the Capitol is in the background. And she thought that was brilliant, and that's what the pictures are of that day, is a bunch of crippled people and their friends holding that crosswalk on State Street for 30 or 40 minutes at lunchtime. I remember we did not get arrested, and I was really disappointed because this was a coordinated protest across the country, and the Capitol Police were terrible in pulling people out of their wheelchairs, and also in Pennsylvania. And even in Denver, there were people using mobility devices getting arrested and handcuffs so they couldn't use their mobility devices. And I think the Salt Lake police chief made a decision that he did not want those photos in his polite state. So they handed us water bottles and they set up some cones.
It's not like you go out searching for problems. They just start falling in your lap and you have to sort through them. And all of a sudden, before you know it, we're in these major, they're not quite legal fights, but they seemed like legal fights with insurance, with your employer, with the schools, almost every aspect of life. You start falling into these issues, and it's like a fight or a battle.
Well, let's talk again about Barbara and what an indomitable force she was. Back in the summer of 2017, we blocked State Street as a way to gain Senator Orrin Hatch's attention. At the time, he was being very dismissive of the disabled rights community and our pleas to protect the ACA. We managed to get a large group together and blocked State Street right in front of his office. And there's an amazing picture of Barbara in her wheelchair with a car trying to barrel through. And she doesn't budge. She didn't even flinch. And that's the kind of steadfast courage she had. You could be coming at her in a car and she's not going to get out of the way. And because of that, Utah has one of the most accessible public transportation systems in the country. It does take people like Barbara, it does take that direct action to finally make the critical change.
Oh, about them going and laying on the steps on the bus and just laying there. They wouldn't move. The bus was stopped. They stalled traffic, rolled in front of the bus so they couldn't go nowhere. I finally went ahead and got arrested, but it was scary to me, being arrested.
You know, when you're talking about disability, you're talking about anything, you're talking about people who live everyday lives, and they have everyday problems, the same problems that anyone has coming and going. It's just that their problems have been doubled, tripled, and quadrupled because they have a disability.
Disability is kind of weird sometimes because you can be disabled from the moment you're conceived, or you can become disabled the first time 6 weeks before you die when you're 90 years old. And it can happen any time in between.
All we want is an accessible system that you use, that we use. If all the buses are accessible, we don't have to worry about a bus going down, because if that bus goes down, everybody's affected, not just the people with disabilities. And so are the able-bodied people are affected, and that's all we've ever wanted, because if that makes us totally part of the system. All we wanted to be is part of the system, not a specialty part.
It all matters, but you have to have a disabled rights, group. You have to have the advocacy. You're always working on a smaller scale than you'd like to, but it works. If you do it right, it works. It's an everyday thing. Every day, everyone lives on the same planet. And, we all have problems, and if people don't understand what our group problems are, the individual problem I bring to the group makes the group bigger. If you have 5 people with problems and they're all mutual problems, you find a mutual solution, you're bigger. And if you need a bigger mutual solution, then you talk to people in other towns or other cities and other states, and your problem is resolvable.
I mean, there was a time when if you were a person with severe mobility issues, you were a recluse because there wasn't anywhere you could go. Places just weren't accessible. And so people kind of stayed hidden away. And the ADA changed all of it because now there was a legal hook to hang your argument on, right? I mean, your place isn't accessible, you may be violating federal law. And that changed the whole way we could approach issues. I know DRAC had some success in the 90s, just bringing a series of lawsuits. If people, weren't building accessible businesses, they just sued them. And they won a series of those, and that was part of how they stayed solvent. But that was all because of the ADA. That was life-changing for a lot of people.
But the reason we have curb cuts that plenty of people who aren't disabled use all the time for their toddler bikes and their wagons and their strollers, that's from the ADA. The reason elevators have to work.
Can you think of other examples?
I don't think we have enough accessibility. The burden is almost always on the disabled person to figure out if that new place they want to go with their friends is going to be accessible enough.
I think the 1990 law was broad enough and forceful enough that it told people that they had to do things with making things accessible. What it's done for the whole other part of disability life and making people more complete, I don't think so. I think if you're disabled, you're disabled. And there are many things that we can do to make the journey better, to make wheeling in and out better, or make crutching in, out, and out better. But it isn't better when you sit down and you can't see, or you can't move your legs, or you can't move your legs and arms, and you're doing things with the movement of your neck. No, that isn't, the only relief in that is that there's something really, truly better than it was 20, 30, and 40 years ago. It really is.
It's interesting. I've seen DRAC, the Disabled Rights Action Committee, change at least 4, maybe 5 times. So in the beginning, you had the Crossroads group, and then it changed with Barbara, and there was a big, really strong group for maybe 7 years, 6 or 7 years, and then that group kind of changed again to another group, and then it changed again to another group, and I'm seeing the disabled rights right now going through another change, and I'm glad to see the change, because I've seen it change so many times. And I know a lot of the older guys are like, oh, I don't like change. But if the disabled rights didn't change with the times, I don't think we would be existing right now. So we've got new blood, new folks, new young people, educated, and they've got their finger on the pulse. And that's I almost want to say a gift.
I think as we've continued to grow, we have really opened the door more to a number of different disabilities. We have a number of people on the neurodivergent spectrum, folks with autism. We've worked with the deaf community. We have worked with the blind, visually impaired community. And I feel that we continue to learn more and more about disability and about access. It's not all cut and dry. It's not black and white. There is no one answer to the accessibility question. And that, more than anything, is what I think we're really trying to push, is this idea of very individualized, specific access for the individual.
As saddening as it is to me, a lot of things haven't really changed that much. We've got thousands of miles of city streets. Nobody even can give us an exact number on how many miles of sidewalks we have in Salt Lake City. But, it's got to be a large number. And they're in the worst condition that you could possibly imagine. Anybody dependent upon a mobility device trying to get around this city is really hurting. And this is, for somebody with a disability, these mobility devices are our lifelines.
I think one of the most pressing issues we're facing right now is just visibility. I think the media is complicit in keeping disabled folks oppressed, keeping them stigmatized, and keeping them out of the public eye. Again, there's this benevolent feeling that we need to protect people, disabled folks, from society. The media needs to start telling stories. The media has got to start saying the word disabled. The media has got to start showing disabled actors telling disabled stories.
Everything's in slow pieces. Every year we have to redo it and redo it and redo it. But we keep trying and we keep going. So our, little celebrations, you enjoyed those, and you're always re-educating representatives and senators every time there's an election. And it's an ongoing thing we have to educate all the time.
We know from the 2010 census and from the data the CDC has gathered since then that 20 to 25% of Americans have a disability of some kind at any given time. That kind of percentage changes elections and can change policy. I mean, that is a big marginalized group. If they could be organized and educated and given direction and things to do.
You really do, you gotta have this group. If you're in a town or a city or a nation, you gotta have this fringe group out there, and they're gonna be fringe because they're the group that nobody else will play with. They're the folks that nobody wants to have anything to do with because they're so bizarre, they're so out there. And again, that's their selling point. That's their beauty. They're probably the closest to raw goodness that there is left anymore in our culture. And that's weird, I know, but still.
And people like myself that was becoming more and more dependent upon mobility devices, all we could do was just keep pushing the government and to keep pushing on the ADA, to keep making it better and coming up with all new improvements.
It's funny if you step back and you say, okay, the fight's over and we can sit back and relax. You can't. That's what I've found is it's never over because people tend to just wipe it all away and forget that anything ever happened, and they'll start creating a society that doesn't include people with disabilities. So, I'm excited to see where DRAC's going, and I hope that it garners, and we can do as much as we used to do. So,
Again, coming full turn, every system needs a direct action confrontation system, and DRAC's it for this town.